contained in the agreement, the main provisions of which are set out in the schedule for the purpose of financing the program to strengthen social services in Barbados. Two.
Senator Dr. the Honourable Chantal Mongrundai.
Mr. President, I want to beg your indulgence to ask that items on the order paper, items number 11 and 12, be taken as a cognate, since both relate to loans under the Special Loans Act, CAP 105.
The question is that items 11 and 12, both resolutions related to the Special Loans Act, CAP 105, be taken as a cognate debate. All of us senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The next, the ayes have it. We will take this as a cognate debate. Please ensure that you speak to both items in the introduction.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me take this opportunity, as others have done, to welcome, first of all, Senator Dr. Connell. Well, I did not know Senator Connell either as a schoolmate or otherwise colleague, but I've had sufficient interactions with Dr. Connell to know, Senator Dr. Connell, to know that he is ultimate professional, extremely responsive, but also as well has a heart for the very profession that he is in, and I'm sure that he will make an excellent contribution to the Senate. I also as well want to welcome, of course, our Senator Tate. What would we do without her biting commentary? I will say no more. And of course, Senator Dr. Crystal Drakes. Again, like everybody else, really, really strong contributions. Senator Drakes and I both having a passion and work in the areas of sustainable development and climate change. Often had very good conversations and debates around those issues as well, and of course her very thoughtful interventions, which makes for an extremely strong and robust Senate, and we of course want to wish her, and I certainly personally want to wish her every success as she moves forward. Mr. President, the two resolutions before us, one, as we've heard before, in relation to the borrowing of the government of Barbados, the sum of Barbados, $100 million by the way of two loans, approximately $50 million each from the OPEC Fund for International Development. And the second one, a loan in the amount of $313.6 million from China Sinopharm International Corporation to provide for the financing, 80% financing, Mr. President, for the design and construction, first of all, one building with an outpatient clinic, a patient ward, a burn unit, and a laboratory center known as the Queen Elizabeth Hospital Enmore Site Extension, Lot 1 project. And secondly, one building with an oncology center, an administration office, and an outside works known as the Queen Elizabeth Hospital Enmore Site Extension Lot 2 project, Mr. President. And those are the resolutions, those are the amounts that we will debate in the resolution that the government is seeking to be able to borrow. Mr. President, we always ask, how do we finance development? How do small island developing states seek to finance development? Finance the critical needs of its citizens, because that's what development is. It is not just only about the infrastructure, but it is about making sure that a government can have the sufficient finances that it needs in order to be able to make sure that those critical needs, education, health care, food security, are sufficiently financed. But at the same time, Mr. President, as the government seeks to be able to do so, it doesn't have finite resources in order on its own, infinite resources, Mr. President, infinite resources in order to be able to do so. So responsible government must make sure that it can mobilize those resources in a strategic way, in a responsible way, Mr. President. Not to borrow when it can't even pay salaries, not to borrow in a way continuously that the government runs itself into a situation in which you have lost confidence internationally, Mr. President, in which no one wants to lend you money, but you have to borrow in a way that allows you to be able to balance, one, the needs, and with a level of fiscal prudence. And that is what this government has a record of doing, Mr. President, and that is what this government is intent on doing. Mr. President, any of us who've gone to a financial institution, we had some young people in here earlier, Mr. President, many of them will want to either take out mortgages, go for car loans, or more importantly, start a business. When you go to a banking institution, you don't always have all of the resources, unless you're very rich, and I don't know if we have any very rich senators in this honorable chamber. Everybody is looking to one side of the chamber. Everybody is looking to one side of the chamber. Oh, clearly all the attention is on the independent and the opposition side. Independently wealthy. Independently wealthy. But unless you are independently wealthy, when you go to the bank to borrow, they look at a number of different metrics, Mr. President. They look at your track record, the extent to which you have a history of repaying, the extent to which you have a history of saving, to which you are in good standing, that there aren't people on record who are saying that you have bad debt. They look, yes, at your ability to repay over the long term based on your positioning, your prospects, your current salary, all of those things, Mr. President, in order to judge the extent to which you are a good investment for them to loan. That also applies as well, Mr. President, national level. When we go to borrow as a country, people examine the extent to which Barbados is a good investment. They look at the extent to which we are able to repay. They look at the growth trajectory and what has been happening within the country, Mr. President. They look at our GDP to debt ratio, Mr. President. So they look at all of those metrics and say, is Barbados a good investment? And clearly, Mr. President, despite those that would want to distort facts and run counter-narratives, Mr. President, Barbados is on a solid growth trajectory, Mr. President, such that we have clawed all the way back from the 23 downgrades to a country now that has continued, Mr. President, a path in which our grades are continually to move up and up and up by our international partners, by those that do the credit rating, Mr. President. Mr. President, the metrics would show, again, that when you look at our debt to GDP ratio, Mr. President, we would agree, and again, the statistics would show, Mr. President, we have this last central bank report, the last quarter central bank report, again, to show that we have a healthy debt to GDP ratio, a healthy fiscal balance. And that is why, Mr. President, that there is a level of confidence that Barbados remains a good investment for others to be able to lend us, because they understand that, again, we have the track record and we have the fiscal space, and that our growth trajectory is such that when they look at it, Barbados can continue to repay. Mr. President, over the period of this government, as we heard in the other place, we've borrowed some $7.34 billion, but Mr. President, we've repaid. We have repaid. We have not reneged. There's no one running us down, Mr. President, to say you have not paid, Mr. President, at a national level. In fact, again, we have repaid $9.346 billion, Mr. President. We are repaying our debt and in our position to continue to be able to repay our debt, Mr. President. That is important. It is also important to realize, Mr. President, and again, the debate around how much we borrow, what is the level of debt, and all of that is important, yes. But we must also contextualize the discussion. When this government came in, we didn't come in, Mr. President, on a wicket that was battling smoothly. We came in on a wicket that had some lumps, Mr. President, that was throwing us some curveballs, Mr. President, in which the ball was swinging, Mr. President. And we have had wicket boxers, and we have had to address and play catch up and repair, Mr. President. We came in a country that was on its knees financially, on its knees, socially as well, Mr. President. No investment happening in education, in the health sector, no buses, no garbage vans, trucks, no garbage trucks, enough garbage on the road, and sewage. All of that, Mr. President, having to be able to clean up and address, even at which we faced, Mr. President, empty coffers. Mr. President, we faced a situation during COVID in which our GDP contracted by 18%, Mr. President. 18%. We face a global environment, even now, that is extremely unfriendly, in which, again, the space for us to be able to borrow, again, is shrinking. In which development assistance, Mr. President, is also contracting. So the playing field for us to be able to mobilize resources, Mr. President, is constrained. Is constrained. So the wicket and context must be laid. Mr. President, even as I say that, the government is not seeking to absolve itself from its responsibility as a government to be able to address fundamentally the needs of its citizens. We don't. We are the government that faces it and fixes it, Mr. President. Does that mean that everything is perfect? It doesn't, Mr. President. There is still much to be done, Mr. President. There is still much to be done. There is still infrastructure to be taken care of. There's still much to be done to transform education. And again, healthcare, as we would come to, Mr. President. Roads to be fixed. But, Mr. President, I built my house from the ground up. My husband and I. And anybody who has built their house from the ground up knows that when you are building, there is heavy initial investment. You have to spend lots of money in the foundation, building those walls, and then the roof. So that there are moments in that process of building in which the investment is extremely heavy. But you recognize that you make that investment because you understand that when you make that investment, it stays for the long term. You stay for the long term. And then you move into a phase in which, Mr. President, you can maintain. We are still a government that is seeking to rebuild, Mr. President, after the wicket that we have had. And in that way, the government, like I said, has to be able to balance its ability to mobilize local resources, again, that it was a constrained private sector as well, that the government still has to be able to lift up and help. That is the nature of small economies, Mr. President. We do not have a large private sector. A large private sector that we can then say, okay, the private sector will do it. The private sector will be able to mobilize the sufficient resources and to be able to invest, particularly in those areas in social development. It doesn't. In other countries, you may have that, but not in small open economies, and certainly not here in Barbados. Across the world, Mr. President, there is that debate about who should be doing the level of investment in social development. Mr. President, very often we do not have a choice. This government has sat and stood behind its mandate then we will treat the critical and urgent needs of our population, Mr. President. We've said that in our manifestos, we've said that publicly, and that is a commitment that we intend to keep, Mr. President. But also as well, there must be a recognition that that investment must be funded. It must be funded, Mr. President. We are a country, unlike many others, in which we provide free primary and secondary, free primary and secondary schooling, Mr. President. That means something, in which children have access to lunches, Mr. President, in which the elderly can board buses, Mr. President, and don't have to pay because the government subsidizes it, Mr. President. At the tertiary level, when we came in as a government, when the government before us had thrown their hands up in the air when faced with the question of how do we finance development, and said we do not have a clue. What do you want me to do? And they borrowed and then cut. Cut tertiary education. And we are a government, even within the constrained environment that we had, the constrained fiscal space, that said, this is not right. Fundamentally and philosophically, we know who Barbados is, we know what we stand for, and therefore we would make the necessary correction. And that is an investment that we continue to make, Mr. President. We all know, again, Transport Board subsidized, Barbados Water Authority. So there is an investment that has to be made in all of these things. And if we are facing a constrained global environment in which development assistance is constrained, if we are facing a space that is constrained, again, because we have a growing private sector that is not yet able to make the level of heavy investment that is needed for the social sector, government has to be able to step in. And one of the ways that it has to be able to step in, as I said, is to make sure that we borrow responsibly. And that is essentially what this government has been doing. And that borrowing has allowed us, Mr. President, to be able to address, again, some of those critical things. We now have these wonderful air-conditioned buses that are there, some of them grants, but some of them as well financed, Mr. President, through loans, IDB loans. Recently, Mr. President, we would have passed a resolution, again, for borrowing from CAF, that again in the healthcare sector allowed us to be able to refurbish 7 polyclinics and 2 new built for purpose polyclinics as well. That is investment, Mr. President, that is needed. That is investment, Mr. President, that is needed. And again, we always think of these things as high economics, but we practice them too at home. You have a little bit of money in the bank, and you make a choice about whether or not you will put all of that money into the thing that you want, or you look at what you have and say, listen, I have a little bit of fiscal space, let me go to the credit union and then borrow twice this amount. So that I keep what I have there in case of a rainy day, but I borrow because I know that I can repay, Mr. President. We do that at the individual level, Mr. President. And this government is saying, we know that we can repay. What we need to do in terms of that heavy investment, Mr. President, we will be able to make sure that we balance. In the case of the loan from the China Sinopharm, that is funding 80%. 80% the government is putting in 20%, Mr. President, in order then to be able to address critical needs in the healthcare sector. Mr. President, there is not a Barbadian who would say that everything is working well within the healthcare sector. There's not a Barbadian. But you say that, and again, we're not the government that will say, put our hands in the air. And Mr. President, let's be honest here. We've heard in this chamber that it is that season. And we could have said, is that season? Why put ourselves up to the critique of the debt and the loans and say, okay, we'll leave it. But we haven't. We've come to this chamber, to the other chamber, because, again, to do the work and the hard work, Mr. President, to put ourselves up to the scrutiny because we understand the long-term trajectory of development that we are committed to, Mr. President. So we are not leaving it. We're not taking the safe road and say, don't bring it. Mr. President, it has to be done, and this government will get it done, Mr. President. That is our commitment. And we started that work in relation to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, so that this loan is not something that we're saying is going to fix all of the problems at the QEH. That is not the intent. The problems at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and there are those who are more expert than I am, so I will tread very carefully here. But what I can say to you, as somebody who understands a little bit of process and management, that the challenges are complex. When you are fixing or attempting to address the challenges within the healthcare sector, that is, again, so wide and has to provide for so many needs, the problems and how we apply fixes to them, Mr. President, also as well have to be nuanced and multi-layered, Mr. President. It is not just a one-off fix. And the investment has to be channeled through a number of different ways in order to address over time. At the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, I know that there have been systemic reviews looking at those challenges and how they can be fixed, Mr. President. I know that on an ongoing basis, even within the A&E, that there is monitoring that happens, Mr. President, right now, that we've introduced personnel that on a day-to-day basis, their job, Mr. President, is to look at the challenges and be able to examine how we fix, how we change, look at targets, how much throughput we want for patients, Mr. President. That is because we are aiming to fix, Mr. President. I know, Mr. President, because one of the other portfolios that I handle within the Prime Minister's office is also as well helping our Prime Minister to look at the public service. I know that from the last estimates, Mr. President, that one of the things that the personnel from the Ministry of Health said to us is that we need more human resources. We just don't have sufficient expertise in the right areas in order then to address the challenges. And the Prime Minister committed that we will either, one, establish new posts for the hospital, the Ministry of Health, but also as well make sure that we can extend critical posts, again, to fulfill some of those human resources. And all of that, Mr. President, needs to be financed. And we have done so. Certainly, Mr. President, again, on a day-to-day basis, I get requests from the public service to be able to extend posts. The Prime Minister would establish posts. And I can tell you that for the Ministry of Health and as well for the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, that we have been doing so in terms of making sure that those posts are established and extended, Mr. President. In particular, when we look, Mr. President, at this particular loan, and you note again that one of the critical areas that it would seek to be able to do is the establishment of an oncology center, Mr. President. And again, those who are more expert can speak to the seriousness of cancer in Barbados. And really and truly, we've heard the challenges that we've had in terms of making sure that we had a linear accelerator that would be here and on island in order then to be able to make sure that we service those patients. Under this loan, we will actually have, Mr. President, a state-of-the-art oncology center that would have a second linear accelerator to add to the one that was just recently, Mr. President, established. And I heard as well that patients are already being treated from that first linear accelerator, Mr. President. I know that the QEH as well is attempting to make sure that it also as well takes care of not just the patients, but also as well the staff. That there are plans to introduce a gym, Mr. President, and a nursery, so that the staff can feel comfortable that their children are being taken care of, Mr. President. Under this loan, We would establish a burn unit, because previously, the burn unit was decommissioned. I can call it that, Mr. President, decommissioned. It was there, then it wasn't there. Mr. President, if I get into under which administration it was decommissioned, we'll have a different conversation. But anyhow, this government is getting it done. And you would see then that under this loan, the establishment again of a burn unit. And Mr. President, like I said, this is just one aspect. This loan, critical intervention for the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, in order to make sure that we again can seek to build out the modern, front-facing, front-serving health sector that we need. The government, under the Ministry of Health, has sought to establish within there a minister whose primary function, Mr. President, is to make sure that we address the issues of health and wellness and how people move and how people eat and exercise. Actually, Mr. President, there's a challenge going on that was sent to me, Mr. President. You're supposed to do, I think it is, how much it is, 50 push-ups, 50 push-ups straight, and then do 40 squats. 40 squats, and it's been sent to our parliamentarians. It's been sent to all parliamentarians, Mr. President, to make sure that we are moving and healthy. And again, Mr. President, to deal with the issues of, again, non-communicable diseases and how we treat that. So a full 360. And again, Mr. President, again, I've said it. There's no intent for us to be able to say that we are perfect, that there are still not problems. But what we are saying is that we are resolute in making sure that as a government, we're able to find the resources as much as we can in a balanced and responsible way. And this loan has that fundamental intent, Mr. President, of being able to address some very critical areas that have been identified in relation to the QEH. Mr. President, the second loan, which is from the OPEC Fund for International Development, is what is called a policy-based loan. So while the loan that I spoke about before from China was a loan that was specifically targeted for the QEH. So that money has to go into the areas that were specifically identified and are specifically identified in the schedule. This loan is a policy-based loan. What a policy-based loan, Mr. President, does is that it gives the government the opportunity to apply the resources, in this case, specifically within the social sector. But it doesn't specifically say in which area, but it gives the government the ability to be able then to look and see where the critical needs are and then be able to apply. One of the challenges that we have very often with partners that we work with for loans and development cooperation is that each partner has their own, either what we call prior actions, structural benchmarks, all of these things that you have to be able to meet. And it can take quite a little bit of manpower to be able to monitor. With this particular loan, what the partners here have said is, listen, we looked at your portfolio. We see what you're doing in the area of social services. And rather than develop a whole new set of metrics that you would have to follow, we would allow you to apply that money to the social services sector using the metrics from another partner, in this case, the IDB, in order then to be able to make sure there's accountability. Under that IDB facility in particular, Mr. President, the IDB provided support in two specific areas. One, in terms of helping the government to build capacity around gender and its gender policies, and two, in assisting the government as it seeks to amalgamate our social services in order to increase efficiency, Mr. President. And that is an ongoing program that is happening. And of course, something like that, that brings together welfare, the child care board, all of these various agencies is something that, again, will take quite a significant investment. And therefore, these allocations of funds, Mr. President, will allow us to be able to do so. In the case, Mr. President, of the funds that are allocated, again, in relation to the 313.6 million, we would note, Mr. President, that it indicates, again, in the schedule, Part 1 and Part 2, again, that we have a term of 14 years with a 4-year moratorium, Mr. President. 4 years moratorium. Again, and then with the interest rate here at 3.5%, payable semi-annually, Mr. President, in both cases. And then, Mr. President, as well, in the case of the 2 loans that we have for the OPEC Fund for International Development, we would know that we have a term of 20 years, again with a grace period, Mr. President, of 5 years, Mr. President, a grace period of 5 years, Mr. President. And again, when we look at the interest rates, Mr. President, we would see that those interest rates are extremely, Mr. President, I would say extremely favorable. In the first instance, we have a fixed, not variable, fixed interest rate of 3.0% per annum, payable semi-annually, Mr. President. And there, I know in the other place, the minister who presented the resolution, the minister responsible for finance, was talking about the mortgage rate. Here, the mortgage rate being almost similar to what we have for an international loan, Mr. President, at 3-point-something%. You can hardly go anywhere now and get that for a major investment. And we have been able to make sure that we have negotiated that. The best rates for the level of investment that we need. Mr. President, it is difficult, and I make no pains about that. I know that it is difficult as a country, as ordinary citizens, to always see all the parts and how they fit together. I know that there is concern, again, about how much the government is borrowing, Mr. President. And that is fair. A conscious population needs to be invested. If the population was not interested, if they were not commenting on what government is doing, then we would question the level of accountability and whether or not we had a citizenry that understood its role in our democratic process. But we have that. But also as well, we say, one, that there is ultimate transparency. Ultimate transparency. The government does not have anything to hide. All of these loans that the government has taken, you will find, again, on Parliament website. You look in our estimates, you would see the history of those transactions, Mr. President, there. And also, we have clear outputs to show in terms of the monies that we have borrowed and what we have borrowed for and what they have delivered for people. What they have delivered for people, Mr. President. Mr. President, with those few words, I am obliged, and I beg that this bill, beg that this resolution. Pardon? Be now passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Margaret Knight. Senator Walters.
Good evening, Mr. President. First, let me join with all the other senators to congratulate and welcome Senator Dr. Connell, and welcome back Senator Tate, and to also wish former Senator Drates well in her endeavors. Mr. President, when Barbados hears that the government is borrowing more money, it is a deep concern to them. They have acknowledged that it is a concern. Senator Monroe Knight said that she knows it's a concern about borrowings publicly. there's a concern about the level of debt and the level of borrowing, and there's also a concern about the level of truth as it relates to these borrowings and this debt. It was said by the Minister of Finance, and it was echoed again in here today by Senator Monroe Knight, that they, since June 2018, actually I will elaborate on it because Senator Monroe Knight, she rushed through some of these details. But it was said by the minister that the government, since June 2018, or I say that the government between June 2018 and September 2025 borrowed 7.341 billion Barbados dollars. It was said by the Minister of Finance that between June 2018 and September of 2025, that the government paid $9.643 billion of debt. Mr. President, at June 2018, the gross public sector debt, as per the Central Bank, was $16.065 billion. If you add the money borrowed by this government, $7.34 billion, and you subtract the money that the government claimed to have paid or repaid, $9.643 billion, the result is $13.763 billion. The Central Bank report at September 2025 shows gross public sector debt at $14.876 billion, Mr. President. That is a gap of $1.1 billion based on this government's assertions of what they borrowed and what they paid. So two things, Mr. President. Either the government borrowed more than they're saying, or they repaid less than they're saying. But regardless of the situation, Mr. President, there must come an answer to this difference, because it is a material difference when you compare the results or what has been reported by the Central Bank and what has been said by the minister and in here this today about what the government borrowed and what the government repaid during June 2018 and September 2025. That's the first thing that I would say, Mr. President. Mr. President, people are scared of the debt because they are concerned that their children and their children's children will be burdened and saddled with a heavy debt burden. And while everyone would agree that we have to borrow for development, we have to borrow in our personal lives, we got to borrow a vehicle loan, we borrow to build our homes, we borrow some of this for our children's education, it doesn't negate the fact that this level of borrowing and the way and how this government is treating to the borrowing is not sustainable for our future generations. Mr. President, as of 2024, December, as reported in the estimates, approved estimates, 2025 to 2026, there are $2.1 billion of loans that the government received since coming to office. And the balance on those loans, Mr. President, is still $2.1 billion. The government of Barbados, the Barbados Labour Party-led government, is borrowing money and they are not repaying the money that they are borrowing. The government of Barbados, Mr. President, earlier this year, when debt became due for payment, this same government borrowed $1 billion Barbados dollars to repay that debt. And that debt was debt that they took out in 2019, Mr. President. So that is why people are concerned, and that is why people are saying they're kicking the can down the road for another government to deal with down the road, for future generations to deal with down the road, which is fine, but it is the extent
of what they are doing, Mr. President. So the Senator Manuel Knight has a few notes, but I don't think she really understands what she's saying, Mr. President. 20 minutes to rush through her notes, but she's not explaining to Barbados that this is strategically not going to work in the benefit of our future generations. Mr. President, the two loans, the resolution speaks to two loans. One that will build an extension of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And who would not welcome an extension of the hospital? Who would not welcome improvements to the hospital? I don't think no one will not welcome that, Mr. President. But the use of funds, how this government is using money, is their concern. Because, Mr. President, in February of 2020, this government announced that it will be using a facility in St. Lucie as a quarantine center during COVID. And they pledged $1.5 million, it was reported then, to do retrofitting and so forth of this facility. In November 2021, Mr. President, it was also reported that the government got a loan for $120 million for that facility in St. Lucie, Mr. President. In April of 2022, this same government said they will convert that facility into something that would deal with medical tourism, medical tourism facility, yes. The Prime Minister made that statement in April of 2022. In June of 2024, that same facility in St. Lucie was used as a satellite medical facility for the Cricket World Cup, Mr. President. So fine, the government comes, brought a resolution, brought $120 million, and everyone can be satisfied to this point that the taxpayers are benefiting from this facility. No questions. You spent money, got us through COVID. You're going to refurbish or upgrade to deal with medical tourism facility. You have used it for a satellite medical facility in Cricket World Cup to give support to our existing medical, if anything happened at the facility. But in July 2025, we can now learn that this facility is being used to house workers for a construction site. $120 million after. But you come to this chamber to borrow $316 million. And I can guarantee you that $120 million has not been repaid. It is a debt on the books of this government. It is a debt that will be burdened by the taxpayers of this country, who has to repay this debt. But no, you come to borrow $360 million. Fine, we want the expansion of the of the hospital. We want the expansion of the hospital. But you're throwing away money. The government has thrown away $120 million down St. Lucie. And I repeat for clarity, in February of 2020, they refurbished the site for COVID. In November of 2021, they borrowed $120 million to refurbish and finish, make it fit for purpose. In April of 2022, they promised they will convert it to a medical tourism facility. In June 2024, it was used as a backup facility for the Cricket World Cup. And a year later, it is housing construction workers who are building hotels in this country. That is how our taxpayers' dollars are misused, mismanaged, abused. So we have to pay the $120 million for construction workers to be sleeping in when the night comes. But we now have to come and approve $360 million for the expansion of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. This is not adding up, Mr. President. if there is some great legitimate reason that the government thinks that they can respond to or share with the public, we would love to hear it. But this, with the naked eye, cannot be the best use of our finances, especially borrowed money. Mr. President, in 2018, the government also, when they came to office, they instituted what was called, or is called, the Health Service Contribution Levy. And I see some smiles on this side of the... Mr. President, the Health Services Contribution Levy, one would think